A most fascinating documentary about the wine industry has been made by Australian filmmakers Warwick Ross and David Roach. Red Obsession focuses on the wine producers of Bordeaux, on the Grand Cru estates, where for centuries the combination of ancient vines, soil, climate and devotion has produced some of the greatest wines in the world. The creation of a good wine is regarded as an art form by the winemakers. The grapes are more miracle than agricultural product.
A miraculous wine is only achieved when temperature, rain, sun and wind are delivered in exact proportions.
In 100 years, you might get 5 or 6 legendary type of vintages. So just in recent memory, 1961 was an absolutely brilliant vintage Bordeaux. The next after that, possibly, well, in fact, is 1982. And after that, 2009.
But this year may rewrite the Bordeaux history books. Producers and critics alike are predicting that 2010 will be another perfect vintage.
But with the global financial crisis, many traditional markets in the West fell away, leaving it to the rich of China to pick up the slack, which they did with gusto.
For many, it is becoming a kind of an obsession.
I like to attend the auctions. I like the bidding. I like the excitement.
Would anyone like to offer you this?
I just want to own it. Whether I would drink it or not, I don't know. But it's something that I really want, and I have to get it. When I'm bidding so aggressively, I don't see anybody around me. All I know is the auctioneer and myself. No matter what, this is what I want. I want to bring it home. When I attended the Aix-Chateau Lafite auction, it's a rare, rare vintage, and I think they only have one bottle. And the auctioneer was going like 300,000, 500,000, 700,000. Then suddenly, I just raised my pedal. I said 1.5 million.
Isn't she great? This beautifully shot and constructed film, cinematographers Lee Pulbrook, Steve Arnold, and editor Paul Murphy must take a lot of credit, with narration by Russell Crowe. It's a revelatory account of a crucial moment in history for the famous French vineyards. It is absolutely fascinating, jaw-dropping in some instances when you realise what prices are being talked about here. But at the same time, the film is more than the sum of its parts. It's about the commodification of wine, the marketing of brands, the buying for status. It's a cautionary tale of our times. And all this began when Warwick Ross sat next to Master of Wine Andrew Caillard on a plane to London. The journey began there but went on to France, Hong Kong and the outer reaches of China. It really is an epic tale.
Totally fascinating. I mean, I thought when I heard the title Red Obsession, it was about reds under the bed in the men's ear, or something like that. But no, it's this fascinating story of how some Chinese, of course, have become fixated by the great wines of France. No mention of whether they're also interested in the great wines of Australia. I mean, is Grange Hermitage...
I think they're soaking them up wherever they can find them now,
well, maybe.
David.
And so the prices are going up, and now the Chinese are making their own wine.
Yeah.
They've got wine
Well, their
growing.
insatiable appetite cannot be satisfied by the world
20 years
production.
ago when I was in China, you couldn't get wine. So things have... And that's the other thing about this film. I mean, it's about how China has changed
absolutely
so dramatically
the money
in
there
the last 20
is
years.
just staggering.
Well, it is astonishing.
It's a communist country.
Yeah.
This is weird.
There you go. So look, it's an interesting documentary, a very interesting documentary indeed. I'm giving it 3.5. What about you?
No, I'm giving it 4 stars. I think it's fabulous.
Wine has outperformed the stock markets, all the major markets, the Dow Jones, the FTSE, gold, all these markets since 1982.
We were looking for some Margaux, vintages from the 90s, those lesser vintages as the market might call them. You want 9.5, that's interesting, okay. That gives me £100 profit for my sale price. I mean, what do I need? Yeah, exactly, yeah.
People will buy, and they'll spend £500,000 or £1 million and buy, 25 cases of Lafite and 25 cases of Latour, and 4 or 5 years' time they sell it. They've never seen the wine. They don't even know what the bottle looks like.
I had bumped into Andrew once or twice before, didn't really know him very well. But we saw each other on this flight between Sydney and London and struck up a conversation, and we were talking about film and wine, and Andrew said to me, you're a filmmaker and you're a winemaker. How come you've never done a film about wine? And my answer was fairly predictable. That, most of the wine films that I'd seen I didn't particularly like. And so it was difficult to know what the angle was with this film. But the flight, as you know, is 24 hours long. So by the time we landed, Andrew and I think, had explored all aspects of Bordeaux and what was happening there. And what was astounding for me was, he said the prices in Bordeaux now are the highest they have ever been in their history. And I said, well, that's strange, because the global financial crisis has just finished and real estate and everything else in the world has tumbled. How can this possibly be? And he said, well, it's not the Americans, they're not buying anymore. The British don't buy these rare wines anymore. It's the Chinese that are fueling this market. And suddenly it felt quite exciting to me, this idea that China had come in. And the idea of making a film about wine was really more about this power shift, economic power shift from the west to the east, but through the prism of Bordeaux. That was where it started. In fact, somebody described the film as the world's first wine thriller, which I love the description of. But the dramatic events that happened during that 12 months were extraordinary.
Thanks to the former generations, they have actually managed to pick the best plots of land in the world. Those little, plots where the drainage is done naturally, where nothing grows but the vines, where the big pebbles to keep the heat at night and to reflect the sun in the daytime. It's a combination, but it took them centuries. And we are just following in their steps.
They're really like artists, these winemakers. And to understand it, you have to understand that history that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, the Romans planted grapes on that land, 1,000 years, 2,000 years ago. So it goes back a long way, and there's a huge tradition. But there's also that risk that every vintage, is going to undermine that tradition. So they take an enormous amount of care. Andrew was telling us this, and we came back to Australia, and Warwick came to me, and we had this meeting with Andrew, and we said to Andrew, look, it could be a good idea. It'll take us about 6 months to raise the funds and write the treatment. And he said, no, you've got to be there in 4 weeks. So somehow or other we had to get all of this together to be in France at this thing called En Primeur, which is where they release the latest vintage. And the reason that we needed to be there, according to Andrew at the time, was that the previous vintage had been called the vintage of the century. And this new vintage was going to be, they say, the rumour was, it was going to be a second vintage of the century, something that had never happened. So if the prices had gone up the year before, what were they going to do this year? And that was, for Andrew, the way he explained it to us, it was like a perfect storm in the wine world. Everything was sort of coalescing at this one moment, and he was anxious for us to be there.